It's hard to get someone to invest time into a fighting game when they have to learn arbitrary motion inputs to do the most basic special moves, but the issue of motion inputs doesn't stem from how difficult they are, it's down to their versatility. There are plenty of videos online showing old people who have only ever played Wii Fit trying to play a game like Call of Duty and struggling with the basic concept of aiming and moving at the same time, but when you actually sit down and learn how to do it, that skill not only transfers directly to other first-person shooters, but other kinds of first-person games and even third-person ones too. But when you learn how to perform Hadouken in Street Fighter, the only times you can ever use that muscle memory again are in other fighting games. No other genre uses a quarter circle forward or a dragon punch motion for basic actions, and because of this, it's simply less efficient for overall gaming enjoyment to learn Street Fighter over Call of Duty. And I know that sounds like a pretty robotic way of looking at this topic, but games are at a point where controls have been pretty standardized across multiple genres, and this lack of parity that fighting games have is indicative of the fact that they haven't really adapted their controls much over the years. Motion inputs were designed when getting people to come back to an arcade cabinet over and over again was the best way to make money. So locking some of the coolest moves in Street Fighter 2 behind an input that required frequent practice made everyone collectively piss themselves in excitement. But arcades are now as dead as the point and click adventure genre, and most people play fighting games at home, so we should have really bitten the bullet by now and moved away from motion inputs completely, right? Well, it's not as simple as you'd think, because for better or for worse, this genre has become somewhat reliant on its unique controls for multiple reasons. Fighting games are unique compared to most other games because the majority of their appeal derives from fighting other people. Doing an infinite combo on an enemy in Final Fight is universally fun because the AI wasn't programmed to feel anything when you do that, but do an infinite combo on a human being in Smash Bros. Melee and they'll definitely be feeling something, so you have to take great care in designing the entire game around that human element, which includes making certain inputs more difficult to mechanically separate skilled and less skilled players. Outright removing things like motion inputs also removes that element of skill that's so intrinsic to the genre at this point. And doing a whole motion takes more time to do than simply pressing a button, which inadvertently balances certain moves that may become overpowered if you can do them by simply pressing a button. This is why some are skeptical of the inclusion of modern controls in Street Fighter 6. They simplify the control scheme of Street Fighter from motion inputs to Smash-style directional inputs, not only allowing new players to get into the game easier, but giving experienced players the ability to automatically hit confirm off of any hit, or to easily punish people in reaction with one-button supers and special moves. But we don't know how it will play out long-term since modern controls have notable downsides, such as a universal 20% reduction in damage and not having access to as many moves as the classic controls, and this is the root of the problem with the idea of modern controls. Techniques such as the Korean backdash may gatekeep the simple act of moving smoothly behind a difficult input, but it's what makes Tekken feel like Tekken. So an alternate control scheme that could make that input easier always has to come with some major drawbacks that doesn't ultimately undermine why hardcore players like the game. The new can never be as good as the old, and this is why I feel that modern controls won't do well at creating hardcore fighting game fans in the long term, since they'll always have to eventually switch over to classic controls anyway in order to compete. Now, if this is what fighting game developers want, then modern controls are great, but other than more game modes, I feel like the next big step in making fighting game controls more accessible is finally standardizing some aspects of control with other genres in ways that don't replace the pre-existing controls. Like, for example, pressing L3 in a 3D fighter could make you either crouch or dash depending on whether you're moving or not. And finally fixing analog sticks so that they can actually function properly are some ideas. These changes will somehow break their respective games, but any change, no matter how minor, is going to do that. So taking on the challenge of standardizing these facets of control without breaking fighting games will be ultimately worth it if it can make the genre feel more familiar to new players than they are currently. Because the issue with motion inputs versus aiming isn't that one is necessarily harder than the other, it's that people have had much more exposure to the controls of Dark Souls or Counter-Strike than with Street Fighter or Tekken. So if we bridge that gap, we may not even need modern controls to break that execution barrier. And if you want to help me break some barriers, you can like, comment and subscribe or join my wonderful patrons on Patreon, including my anonymous patron, and yeah, that's basically all I've got. You can go now.